On Democracy by Robert A. Dahl, voiced by the Catalyst Gamer. Part 3, Actual Democracy. Chapter 8. What political institutions does large-scale democracy require? What does it mean to say that a country is governed democratically? In this chapter we'll focus on the political institutions of democracy on a large scale. That is, the political institutions necessary for a democratic country. We're not concerned here, then, with what democracy in a very small group might require, as in a committee. We also need to keep our standard warning in mind. Every actual democracy has always fallen short of the democratic criteria described in Part 2 and shown in Figure 4 on page 38. Finally, we should be aware, in this chapter, as elsewhere, that in ordinary language we use the word democracy to refer both to a goal or an ideal and to an actuality. That is only a partial attainment of the goal. For the time being, therefore, I'll count on the reader to make the necessary distinctions when I use the words democracy, democratically, democratic government, democratic country, and so on. If a country is to be governed democratically, what would be required? At minimum, it would need to possess certain political arrangements, practices, or institutions that would go a long way, even if not all the way, towards meeting ideal democratic criteria. Words about words. Political arrangements sound as if they might be rather provisional, which they could well be in a country that has just moved away from non-democratic rule. We tend to think practices as more habitual, and therefore more durable. We usually think of institutions as having settled in for a long haul, passed on from one generation to the next, as a country moves from a non-democratic to a democratic government. The early democratic arrangements gradually become practices which in due time turn into settled institutions. Helpful though these distinctions may be, however, for our purposes it will be more convenient if we put them aside and settled for the institutions. How can we know? How can we reasonably determine what political institutions are necessary for large-scale democracy? We might examine the history of countries that have changed their political institutions in response, at least in part, to demands for broader popular inclusion and effective participation in government and political life. Although in earlier times those who sought to gain inclusion and participation were not necessarily inspired by democratic ideas, from about the 18th century onward they tended to justify their demands by appealing to democratic and republican ideas. What political institutions did they seek, and what were actually adopted in these countries? Alternatively, we could examine countries where the government is generally referred to as democratic by most of the people in that country, by many persons in other countries, and by scholars, journalists, and the like. In other words, in ordinary speech and scholarly discussion, the country is called a democracy. Third, we could reflect on a specific country or group of countries, or perhaps even a hypothetical country, in order to imagine as realistically as possible what political institutions would be required in order to achieve democratic goals to a substantial degree. We would undertake a mental experiment, so to speak, in which, Figure 6, what political institutions does large-scale democracy require? Large-scale democracies require 1. Elected officials, 2. Free, fair, and frequent elections, 3. Freedom of expression, 4. Alternative sources of information, 5. Associational autonomy, 6. Inclusive citizenship. In which we speak would reflect carefully on human experiences, tendencies, possibilities and limitations, and design a set of political institutions that would be necessary for large-scale democracy to exist, yet feasibly and attainably within the limits of human capacities. Fortunately, all three methods converge on the same set of democratic political institutions. These then are minimal requirements for a democratic country. See Figure 6. The political institutions of modern representative democracy. Briefly, the political institutions of modern representative democratic government are: 1. Elected officials. Control over government decisions about policy is constitutionally vested in officials elected by citizens. Thus, modern, large-scale democratic governments are representative. 2. Free, fair and frequent elections. Elected officials are chosen in frequent and fairly conducted elections in which coercion is comparably uncommon. 3. Freedom of expression. Citizens have a right to express themselves without danger of severe punishment on political matters broadly defined and including criticism of officials, the government, the regime and the socio-economic order, and the prevailing ideology. 4. Access to alternative sources of information. Citizens have a right to seek out alternative and independent sources of information from other citizens, experts, newspapers, magazines, books, telecommunications, and the like. Moreover, alternative sources of information actually exist that are not under the control of the government and any other single political group attempting to influence public political beliefs and attitudes, and these alternative sources are effectively protected by law. 5. Associational autonomy. To achieve their various rights, including those required by the effective operation of democratic political institutions, citizens also have a right to form a relatively independent associations or organizations, including independent political parties and interest groups. 6. Inclusive citizenship. No adult permanently residing in the country and subject to its laws can be denied the right that are available to others and are necessary to the 5 political institutions just listed. These include rights to vote in the elections of officials in free and fair elections, to run for elective office, to free expression, to form and participate in independent political organizations, to have access to independent sources of information, and rights to other liberties and opportunities that may be necessary to effective operation of the political institutions on a large-scale democracy. The political institutions in perspective. Ordinarily, these institutions do not arrive in a country all at once. As we saw in our brief history of democracy, Chapter 2, the last two are intrinsically latecomers. Until the 20th century, universal suffrage was denied in both the theory and the practice of democratic and republican government. More than any other single feature, universal suffrage distinguishes modern representative democracy from all earlier forms of democracy. The time of arrival and the sequence in which institutions have been introduced have varied tremendously. In countries where the full set of democratic institutions arrived earliest and have endured to the present day, the older democracies, elements of a common pattern emerge. Elections to a legislature arrived earlier on. In Britain, as early as the 13th century. In the United States during its colonial period in the 17th and 18th century. The practice of electing higher law-making officials was followed by a gradual expansion of the rights of citizens to express themselves on political matters and to seek out and exchange information. The right to form associations with explicit political goals tended to follow still later. Political factions and partisan organization were generally viewed as dangerous, divisive, subversive of political order and stability, and injurious to the public good. Yet, because political associations could not be suppressed without a degree of coercion that an increasingly large and influential number of citizens regarded as intolerable, they were often able to exist as more or less clandestine associations until they emerged from the shadows into the full light of day. In the legislative bodies, what once were factions became political parties. The ins, who served in the government of the day, were opposed to the outs, or what in Britain came to be officially styled His or Her Majesty's loyal opposition. In the 18th century, Britain, the faction supporting the monarch and the opposing faction supported by much of the gentry in the country, were gradually transformed into Tories and Whigs. During that same century in Sweden, partisan adversaries in Parliament somewhat facetiously called themselves the Hats and the Caps. During the final years of the 18th century in the newly formed Republic of the United States, Thomas Jefferson, the Vice President, and James Madison, leader of the House of Representatives, organized their followers in Congress to oppose the policies of the Federalist President John Adams and his Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton. To succeed in their opposition, they soon realized that they would have to do more than oppose Federalists in the Congress and the Cabinet. They would need to remove their opponents from office. To do that, they had to win national elections, and to win national elections, they had to organize their followers throughout the country. In less than a decade, Jefferson, Madison, and other sympathetics with their views created a political party that was organized all the way down to the smallest voting precincts, districts, and municipalities, whatever. An organization that would reinforce the loyalty of their followers between and during elections, campaigns, and make sure that they came to the polls. Their Republican Party, soon renamed Democratic Republican, and a generation later Democratic, became the first popular-based electoral party in the world. As a result, one of the most fundamental and distinctive political institutions of modern democracy, the political party, has burst beyond its confines in Parliament and legislators, in order to organize the citizens themselves and mobilize party supporters in national elections. By the time the young French aristocrat Alexandre de Tocqueville visited the United States in 1830, the first 5 democratic political institutions described above had already arrived in America. The institutions seemed to him so deeply planted and pervasive that he had no hesitation in referring to the United States as a democracy. In that country, he said, the people were sovereign. Society governs itself for itself, and the power of the majority was unlimited. He was astounded by the multiplicity of associations into which Americans organized themselves, for every purpose, it seemed. And towering among these associations were the 2 major political parties in the United States. It appeared to Tocqueville democracy was about as complete as one could imagine it ever becoming. During the century that followed, all 5 of the basic democratic institutions Tocqueville observed during his visit to America were consolidated in more than a dozen other countries. Many observers in Europe and the United States concluded that any country that aspired to be civilized and progressive would necessarily have to adopt a democratic form of government. Yet, everywhere the 6th fundamental institution, inclusive citizenship, was missing. Although Tocqueville affirmed that the state of Maryland, which had been founded by men of rank, was the first to proclaim universal suffrage, Like almost all other men and many women of his time, he tactically assumed that universal did not include women, nor indeed some men. Maryland's universal suffrage, it so happened, also excluded most African Americans. Elsewhere, in countries that were otherwise more or less democratic, as in America, a full half of all adults were completely excluded from national political life, simply because they were women. In addition, large numbers of men were denied the suffrage because they could not meet literacy or property requirements, an exclusion supported by many people who considered themselves advocates of the Democratic or Republican government. Although New Zealand extended suffrage to women in national elections in 1893 and Australia in 1902, in countries otherwise democratic, women did not gain suffrage in national elections until about 1920, in Belgium, France and Switzerland. Countries that most would have called highly democratic, women could not vote until after World War II. Because it is difficult for many today to grasp what democracy meant to our predecessors, let me re-emphasize the difference in all democracies and republics throughout 25 centuries. The rights to engage fully in political life were restricted to a minority of adults. Democratic governments was a government by males only, and not all of them. It was not until the 20th century that in both theory and practice democracy came to require that the rights to engage fully in political life must be extended, with very few, if any, exceptions, to the entire population of adult permanently residing in the country. Taken in their entirety, then, these 6 political institutions constitute not only a new type of political system, but a new kind of popular government, a type of democracy that had never existed throughout the 25 centuries of experience since the inauguration of democracy in Athens and a republic in Rome. Because the institutions of modern representative democratic government, taken in their entirety, are historically unique, it is convenient to give them their own name. This modern type of large-scale democratic government is sometimes called polyarchical democracy. Words about words. Polyarchy is derived from Greek words meaning many and rule, thus rule by the many, as distinguished from rule by the one, or monarch, and rule by the few, oligarchy or aristocracy. Although the term had been rarely used, a colleague and I introduced it in 1953 as a handy way of referring to modern representative democracy with universal suffrage. Hereafter I shall use it in that sense. More precisely, a polyarchical democracy is a political system with the 6 democratic institutions listed above. Polyarchical democracy, then, is different from representative democracy, with restricted suffrage as in the 19th century. It is almost different from older democracies and republics that not only had a restricted suffrage, but lacked many of the other crucial characteristics of polyarchical democracy, such as political parties, rights to form political organizations to influence or oppose the existing government, organized interest groups, and so on. It is different, too, from the democratic practices in units so small that members can assemble directly and make or recommend policies or laws. I will learn to this difference in a moment. Although other factors were often at work, the 6 political institutions of polyarchical democracy came about, in part at least, in response to demands for inclusion and participation in political life. In countries that are widely referred to as democracies today, all 6 exist. Yet you might as well ask, are some of these institutions no more than past products of historical struggles? Are they no longer necessary for democratic government? And if they are still necessary today, why? The factor of size. Before answering these questions, I need to call attention to an important qualification. As I warned at the beginning of this chapter, we are considering institutions necessary for the government of a democratic country. Why country? Because all the institutions necessary for a democratic country would not always be required for a unit much smaller than a country. Consider a democratically governed committee, or a club, or a very small town. Although equality in voting would seem to be necessary, small units like these might manage without many elected officials. Perhaps a moderator to preside over meetings, a secretary-treasurer to keep minutes and accounts. The participants themselves could decide just about everything directly during their meetings, leaving details to the secretary-treasurer. Governments of small organizations would not have to be full-fledged representative governments in which citizens elect representatives charged with enacting laws and policies. Yet these governments could be democratic, perhaps highly democratic. So too, even though they lacked political parties or other independent political associations, they might be highly democratic. In fact, we might concur with the classical democratic and republican view that in small associations organized factions are not only unnecessary but downright harmful. Instead of conflicts of exacerbated by factionalism, caucuses, political parties, and so on, we might refer unity, consensus, agreement achieved by discussion and mutual respect. The political institutions strictly required for democratic government depend, then, on the size of the unit. The 6 institutions listed above developed because they are necessary for governing countries, not smaller units. Polyarchical democracy is democratic government on the largest scale of the nation, state, or country. To return to our question, are the political institutions of polyarchical democracy actually necessary for democracy on the large scale of a country? If so, why? To answer these twin questions, let us recall what the democratic process requires. Look at Figure 7. Figure 7. Why the institutions are necessary. In a unit as large as a country, these political institutions of polyarchical democracy are necessary to satisfy the following democratic criteria. 1. Elective representatives. The criteria is effective participation and control of the agenda. 2. Free, fair and frequent elections. The criteria is voting equality, control of the agenda. 3. Freedom of expression. The criteria is effective participation, enlightened understanding, and control of the agenda. 4. Alternative information. The criteria is effective participation, enlightened understanding, and control of the agenda. 5. Associational autonomy. The criteria is effective participation, enlightened understanding, and control of the agenda. 6. Inclusive citizenship. The criteria is full inclusion. Why and when does democracy require elected representatives? As the focus of democratic government shifted to large-scale units like nations and countries, the question arose: how can citizens participate effectively when the number of citizens becomes too numerous or too widely dispersed geographically, or both, as in the case of a country, for them to participate conveniently in making laws by assembly in one place? And how can they make sure that matters which they are most concerned are adequately considered by officials? That is, how can citizens control the agenda of government decisions? How best to meet these democratic requirements in a political unit as large as the country is? Of course, enormously difficult, indeed, to some extent unachievable. Yet, just as with the other highly demanding democratic criteria, this too can serve as standing for evaluating alternative possibilities and solutions. Clearly, the requirements could not be met if top officials of the government could set the agenda and adopt policies independent of the wishes of citizens. The only feasible solution, though it is highly imperfect, is for citizens to elect their top officials and hold them more or less accountable through elections by dismissing them, so to speak, in subsequent elections. To us that solution seems obvious, but what may appear self-evident to us was not at all obvious to our predecessors. As we saw in Chapter 2, until fairly recently, the possibility that citizens could, by means of election, choose and reject representatives with the authority to make laws remained largely foreign to both the theory and practice of democracy. As we saw, too, the election of representatives mainly developed during the Middle Ages, when monarchs realized that in order to impose taxes, raise armies, and make laws, they needed to win the consent of the nobility, the higher clergy, and a few not so common commoners in the larger towns and cities. Until the 18th century, then, the standard view was that democratic or republican government meant rule by the people, and if the people were to rule, they had to assemble in one place and vote on decrees, laws, or policies. Democracy would have to be town meeting democracy. Representative democracy was a contradiction in terms. By implication, whether explicit or implicit, a republic or democracy could actually exist only in a small unit, like a town or city. Writers who held this view, such as Montesquieu and Jean-Jacques Rousseau, were perfectly aware of the disadvantages of a small state, particularly when it confronted the military superiority of a much larger state, and was therefore extremely pessimistic about the future prospects for genuine democracy. Yet the standard view was swiftly overpowered and swept aside by the onrushing force of a national state. Rousseau himself clearly understood that for a government of a country as large as Poland, for which he proposed a constitution, representation would be necessary, and shortly thereafter the standard view was driven off the stage of history by the arrival of democracy in America. As late as 1787, when the Constitutional Convention met in Philadelphia to design a constitution appropriate for large countries with an ever-increasing population, the delegates were acutely aware of the historical tradition. Could a republic possibly exist on the huge scale the United States had already attained? Not to mention the ever grander scale the delegates foresaw. Yet no one questioned that if a republic were to exist in America, it would have to take the form of representative republic. But because of the lengthy experience with representation in colonial and state legislatures and in the Continental Congress, the feasibility of a representative government was practically beyond debate. By the middle of the 19th century, the traditional view was ignored, forgotten, or, if remembered at all, treated as irrelevant. It is evident, John Stuart Mill wrote in 1861, that the government which can fully satisfy all the exigencies of the social state is one in which the whole people participate. That any participation, even in the smallest public function, is useful. That the participation should, everywhere, be as great as the general degree of improvement of the community will allow, and that nothing less than ultimate desirable than the admission of all to a share in the sovereign power of a state. But since all cannot, in a community exceeding a single small town, participate personally in any but some minor portions of the public business, it follows that the ideal type of a perfect government must be representative. Why does democracy require free, fair, frequent elections? As we have seen, if we accept the desirability of the political equality, then every citizen must have an equal and effective opportunity to vote. and all votes must be counted as equal. If equality in voting is to be implemented, then clearly elections must be free and fair. To be free means that citizens can go to the polls without fear of reprisal. And if they are to be fair, then all votes must be counted as equal. Yet free and fair elections are not enough. Imagine electing representatives for a term of, say, 20 years. If citizens are to retain final control over the agenda, these elections must be also frequent. How best to implement free and fair elections is not obvious. In the late 19th century, the secret ballot began to replace a public show of hands. Although open voting still has a few defenders, secrecy has become the general standard. A country in which it is widely violated would be judged as lacking free and fair elections. But debate continues as to the kind of voting system that best meets standards of fairness. It's a system of proportional representation, PR, like that employed in most democratic countries. Fairer than the first-past-the-post system used in Great Britain and the United States, reasonable arguments can be made for both, as we will see when we return to this question in Chapter 10. In discussions about different voting systems, however, the need for a fair system is assumed. How best to achieve fairness and other reasonable objectives is simply a technical question. How frequent should elections be? Judging from 20th century practices in democratic countries, a rough answer might be that annual elections for legislative representatives would be a bit too frequent, and anything more than about 5 years would be too long. Obviously, however, Democrats can reasonably disagree about the specific interval and how it might vary with different offices and different traditional practices. The point is that without frequent elections, citizens would lose a substantial degree of control over their elected officials. Why does democracy require free expression? To begin with, freedom of expression is required in order for citizens to participate effectively in political life. How can citizens make their views known and persuade their fellow citizens and representatives to adopt them unless they can express themselves freely and about all matters bearing on the conduct of the government? And if they are to take the views of others into account, they must be able to hear what others have to say. Free expressions means not just that you have a right to be heard, it also means that you have a right to hear what others have to say. To acquire an enlightened understanding of possible government's actions and policies also requires freedom of expression. To acquire civic competence, citizens need opportunities to express their own views, learn from one another, engage in discussion and deliberation, read, hear and question experts, political candidates, and persons whose judgments they trust, and learn in other ways that dependent on freedom of expression. Finally, without freedom of expressions, citizens would soon lose their capacity to influence the agenda of the government's decisions. Silent citizens may be perfect subjects for an authoritarian ruler. They would be a disaster for democracy. And so we have the falling rates of voter participation in Great Britain and the journey to autocracy. Anyway, why does democracy require the availability of alternative and independent sources of information? Like freedom of expression, the availability of alternative and relatively independent sources of information is required by several of the basic democratic criteria. Consider the need for enlightened understanding. How can citizens acquire the information they need in order to understand the issues if the government controls all of the important sources of information, Communist China, or for that matter if any single group enjoys a monopoly in providing information, Rupert Murdoch? Citizens must have access then to alternative sources of information that are not under the control of the government or dominated by any other group or point of view. Or think about effective participation and influence in the political public agenda. How could citizens participate effectively in political life if all the information they could acquire was provided by a single source, say the government, or for that matter a single party, faction or interest? Why does democracy require independent associations? As we saw earlier, it took a radical turnabout in ways of thinking to accept the need for political associations, interest groups, lobbying organizations, political parties. Yet if a large republic requires that representatives be elected, then how are elections to be contested? Forming an organization such as a political party gives a group an obvious electoral advantage, and if one group seeks to gain that advantage, will not others who disagree with their policies, and why should political activity cease between elections? Legislatures can be influenced, causes can be advanced, policies promoted, appointments sought. So unlike a small city or town, the large scale of democracy in a country makes political associations both necessary and desirable. In any case, how can they prevent, without impairing the fundamental rights of citizens, to participate effectively in governing? In a large republic, then, they are not only necessary and desirable, but inevitable. Independent associations are also a source of civic education and enlightenment. They provide citizens not only with information, but also with opportunities for discussion, deliberation, and the acquisition of political skills. Why does democracy require inclusive citizenship? The answer is to be found, of course, in the reasons that brought us to the conclusion of the last chapter. We hardly need to repeat them here. We can view the political institutions described in this chapter and summarized in Figure 6 in several ways. For a country that lacks one or more of the institutions, and is to that extent not yet sufficiently democratic, knowledge of the basic political institutions can help us to design a strategy for making full transition to modern representative democracy. For a country that has only recently made the transition, that knowledge can help inform us about the crucial institutions that need to be strengthened, deepened, and consolidated, because they are all necessary for modern representative democracy. Polyarchical democracy, we can also view them as establishing a minimum level for democratization. Those of us who live in the older democracies where the transitional to democracy occurred some generations ago, and the political institutions listed in Figure 6 are by now solidly established, face a different and equally difficult challenge. For even if the institutions are necessary to democratization, they are definitely not sufficient for achieving fully the democratic criteria listed in Figure 6 and described in Chapter 4. Are we not then at liberty and indeed obligated to appraise our democratic institutions against these criteria? It seems obvious to me, as to many others, that judged against democratic criteria, our existing political institutions display many shortcomings. Consequently, just as we need strategies for bringing about a transition to democracy in non-democratic countries, and for consolidating democratic institutions in newly democratized countries, so in older democratic countries we need to consider whether and how to move beyond our existing level of democracy. Let me put it this way. In many countries the task is to achieve democratization up to the level of polyarchical democracy. In the challenge to citizens in the older democracies is to discover how they might achieve a level of democratization beyond polyarchical democracy.